Mhm.
Okay, great. Just so everyone knows, I just started recording this. I hope everyone had a restful break. And welcome to our first colloquium talk, which is part of our Brown Bag series for racial justice. And this is funded by the Division of the Social Sciences. So today's colloquium, as I'm sure you all know, will focus on the topic of decolonizing classical theory. And the purpose of this colloquium is to examine approaches to teaching theory that allow for a critical interrogation and expansion of the canon. So we have two panelists with us, Professor Zine Magubane and Professor Victoria Reyes. And Zine is a professor of sociology at Boston College. She's a historical sociologist whose current work focuses on the intertwined theories of the discipline of sociology and the global social processes of slavery, imperialism, and colonialism. And she's working on a book project which is extremely relevant for today's discussion called Decolonizing the Classical Canon, Slavery, Colonialism, and the Making of a Science of Society. And her work has appeared in Gender and Society, Science, Critical Sociology, and Current Sociology, among other venues. Victoria is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of California, Riverside, and she's the author of Global Borderlands, Fantasy, Violence, and Empire in Subic Bay, Philippines. And in this book, she examines the everyday experiences of people living and working in Subic Bay, an area where the US military continues to be an overt presence. Her work has been published in Social Forces, Theory and Society, Sociology of Race and Ethnicity, Ethnography, other venues, and she has been an active voice in conversations in the theory community around issues of decolonizing classical theory. So before we get started, I'd just like to thank the many people who helped make this event happen. Jean Beeman, Verda Taylor, and Lisa Blanco helped me organize the event. And I consulted with a bunch of different faculty members in the department, including Terrell Winder, Simonetta Falasco Zamponi, John Cruz, Windance Twine, and Kevin Anderson about the questions for the panel discussion. So we'll get our discussion started now. And after the discussion, you'll have the chance to ask our panelists questions. So please start thinking about these as the panelists are talking. So my first question is, we often hear of the canon in sociology as Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and we've only recently begun the process of canonizing Du Bois, of course. So thinking about this sort of supposed canon, are these theories useful for thinking about current sociological issues, or are they not helpful? And we'll sort of switch off. So maybe this time we can start with Zine first, and then Victoria can respond as well.
Sure. Thanks for the invitation, and hoping to have some fun today. I do think that the canon as it stands obviously needs a reboot. However, I have always been of the opinion that sociology is unique in that we are less organized around a set of common theories or practices and more arranged around an idea of a common history, which, good, bad, or indifferent, that's how it is. And I don't see the Marx, Weber, and Durkheim going anywhere anytime soon. And I'd also think that the sort of transformation we think about, we want to invite as many people in as possible. And most people are trained with Marx, Weber, and Durkheim and the way in which they do classical theory. So my idea is like, oh, how do we start where we are and decolonize from there? I think that actually the ways in which it appears to us that the original three who got canonized, Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, it appears to us that issues of slavery and colonialism were invisible to them. And we often think that it was invisible because they didn't think about it. But I believe what Susan Buck-Morss said in her book, Hegel in Haiti, about philosophy is equally true about sociology, in that she says that you have to be aware of two silences. Silent, and oftentimes the silence didn't happen at the time of when the theorists wrote. Rather, the silence happened through the canonization process. That actually, that she says the Haitian Revolution has become more unthinkable through the disciplinary discourses through which we inherit the past. I say absolutely that for Marx, Weber, and Durkheim as well. A revisit of their work demonstrates the degree to which colonialism, slavery, imperialism were quite visible to all three. And they were actually in dialogue with persons that we think that they were not, Weber and Du Bois, for example. So, not to speak too long, but I do actually think that there is tremendous potential for a revisiting of the people that we have around a set of questions that they were also dealing with that are of interest to us, that allows us to read different things from them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Victoria, yeah, please respond.
Yeah, so I guess I want to give a little context into kind of where I'm coming from in theory is, before I entered grad school, I had one sociology class, and then I was in a sociology PhD program. And so in 2008, my classical theory class was taught by Kathy Newman, and it included Du Bois, it included Mead, it included Cooley, as well as Marx, Weber, Durkheim. So in my graduate training, I really didn't see this kind of big three. I eventually saw the emphasis in the canonization of Marx, Weber, Durkheim, but I think it was more through conversations with other graduate students, right? And this reinforcement of the big three, but my own training kind of was much broader, right? And so that's kind of my own approach, is to not deify these three. So the question is, are these helpful? And I like to think of classical theory and who to teach as what's useful, that should be the basis of who and what we should teach. That is why some theories are considered classical, right? They help inform the basis of our thinking, the foundation of our research. So if certain writings are no longer useful, I don't think they should really be taught. So in some respect, right? So this past year, I teach undergraduate classical theory. In part due to the pandemic, I cut things. I didn't teach Protestant work ethic, right? I didn't teach about Durkheim's religious theories, and I'm probably not going to moving forward, right? Because I see when I teach these things that there are a lot of problems with their work. Yes, it forms the basis, but the ways in which they're writing, the ways in which people interpret them, has this racism that informs their work and how they see other societies, right? But I do think Weber's work on bureaucracy, on class status party is useful. Durkheim's work on suicide, about thinking about social facts, Marx in particular on capitalism and exploitation, is all incredibly useful. So, as I'm moving forward and thinking about my syllabus and who do I teach and who not, I'm probably not going to teach division of labor and society. That may be blasphemous to some people, right? How can you not teach it? I don't think it's as useful, because I also teach not only Du Bois, but Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells. I teach so many more. So I think that in order to teach, what we teach has to be useful. And I also think we have to think about the extent to who is doing the canonization, right? Who's teaching classical theory and how they teach it. And to me, this is why teaching is such an important part of our profession. How we present material and engage in our undergrads and graduate students shapes their thinking and how they approach research and teaching. But teaching remains undervalued, right, at research universities, and people aren't taught to teach. So I'm grateful for my own pedagogical teaching at Bryn Mawr, where I was taught, right? Whereas at research universities, it tends to be separate from our research. It tends to be seen as taken away from our research. But I think it's necessary that we actually need to teach in order to think about classical theory. We need to teach for people to engage in their work. We need to think about how useful or how not it is. And instead of classical theory as something that is untouchable, is canonical, and instead get students thinking about how useful it is. And so, Connell also has kind of this 1997 piece about how we need to interrogate how what is considered classical theory structures sociological thought. And so, so that was the long version. The too long didn't read version is, I think they're useful, but I also think it's helpful that we shouldn't always teach the same writings if it's no longer useful for what's going on. I think that and that's okay. They weren't always canonical. They weren't always part of the founding.
Great, thank you so much. That was really helpful. And you touched on so many things that I'd like to expand on. So Before we talk about other theorists, I just wanted to sort of expand on this point. And to the extent that we find at least certain writings of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim to be useful, could each of you expand a bit on how we should teach their work?
Sure. So how I orient my syllabus is to note that these were not people who were kind of divorced from context, thinking about developing the concepts for the sake of the concepts. They're always responding to a historically constituted set of problems. And again, the historically constituted set of problems, oftentimes things like slavery appear. They don't appear in the way that we expect them to appear. We always think of slavery as ultimately like a racial question, which of course it is, but it oftentimes appears when you read them carefully and they're discussing maybe something else like free trade, mercantilism. But so interestingly, because many of these people wrote so much, right? And only a certain number of things, like how you mentioned the division of labor in society, or certain ones get picked up and certain don't. And certain contexts get picked up. So I have found that I often orient it around that there was this huge question, quite related to the ending of slavery, of what makes people work. What happens when the market comes the source of compulsion rather than the ownership of the work in their person? And this was incredibly visible to Marx, of course. It was actually also quite visible to Weber. Weber, actually, that's why he wanted to go to Tuskegee Institute. And he asked, Du Bois to write this article about the Southern labor system. And they were all really quite interested because they saw that the breakup of the South was so many things. It was the first uncompensated dispossession of property holders they'd ever seen, because they were used to the British and the French system. So even like someone like Auguste Comte, that you would think all that was just invisible to him. We think about him as the positivist guy, that if you look at his full work, he included Toussaint Louverture in his calendar of great men. He wrote about these free labor experiments that were happening in Haiti and Sierra Leone. So all of these things are actually quite visible, and I'm still in the process of working it out. But I think that question of, and the French went through it first, of what happens when you move to an entirely new system of compulsion, which was new to everybody at that time. And they often put it within the breakup of feudalism as of a piece, which we're all quite familiar with sociology as sort of talking about the new industrial society. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that question, that becomes one of my orienting questions. And then I find, just to quickly finish up, that it puts them into conversation with Anna Julia Cooper, who also wrote about the Haitian Revolution, who wrote this book, Voice from the South, right? So it actually allows people to come in to the syllabus speaking about things that they also share in common, whereas I often find that the diversification of the canon means bringing in a female scholar to talk about gender, bringing in a Black scholar to talk about race, as though they only talked about those things, and that those things weren't issues of political economy and the social, that was mostly, everybody teaches souls of Black folk and double consciousness, but there's so many other things to teach about Du Bois as well.
Great, Victoria, yeah.
Yeah, I agree 100%, Zane, with you. I think that, the more I teach undergrad classical theory, the more I'm just choosy about what I teach and which pieces of writing I teach. So I have a recent publication in Sociology of Race and Ethnicity that gets at this particular question. And so one is I include in my syllabus, right, in all of my syllabi actually, the politics of the syllabus, right? Acknowledgement, I think, is the first important step. It can't be the only step, but it's important to note from the onset that syllabi are not neutral, right? That they have relevance, and to very clearly mark out, this is what we're going to be doing for this class, but also just as important, Zane talks about these two silences, what are we not doing in this class? And to contextualize it. And I think that's so important to recognize it and not present syllabi as these kind of neutral objective things. The second is I situate them in their biographies, right? That's so important. I know that there's this big push for kind of We don't need their biographies. We just need their concepts. But I completely disagree. I think that's asociological, in fact, because I think what that does is it shows exactly what Zane was talking about, how they came about, who were they in conversation with, what was going on at the time. You know, I also teach Hobbes, and it's important to know for Leviathan that Hobbes was a tutor for a royal family in exile. That is how he was thinking about social order, about the Leviathan, right? And I think what this does is it asks students, you know, undergrad or graduate or one another, to think about, and this is what Sunny said, so I'm just kind of parroting some of what you say, that these scholars are in conversation with one another. They know one another. They're in conversation, and so I think that's so important. And finally, I really include in teaching classical theory active learning, right? I always ask, and I know that we'll get to this later, is to compare and contrast thinkers, who's an argument, but also what relevance is it to contemporary life, right? And it allows students, what it does is to understand theory as historically and materially situated, created by flawed people, and subject to critique, right? Like, I think that is the most important, that it's this production of knowledge. And so, you know, I think we have to teach what we teach in Marx, Weber, Durkheim in that way, to kind of undeify these people and show that they are people in certain conversations and particular life circumstances. And that's the way we need to teach theory, right? And because otherwise it can get up in the clouds. I've had students, we were talking before this started, UCR has 15 undergrad majors. And when I teach theory, people are like, I never knew there were women theorists. I never knew. And so I think that it's so important for these things on how we teach classical theory.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really helpful. So my next question is, in our teaching, how can we situate this canon and the emergence of the canon as a quote canon in the colonial context? And what are the implications of the canon being dominated by European theorists? And I think I messed up the order a little bit. So let's start with Victoria this time.
Actually, maybe I can start with the next one. This seems to be the topic, you know, your book is about. So I would love to kind of hear from you, and I'll follow up. Maybe I can just go. I'll start the next one.
Sounds good.
Well, one thing. So Victoria, you referenced Connell's iconic article, "Why is Classical Theory Classical?" And how I actually start both in the book and as I introduce students to what is it that we're going to be doing here, is I note an interesting silence that occurs within Connell's own work, which is when she describes very well, I think captures it, that the canon arises to solve a crisis. The crisis is the collapse of the progress narrative in the wake of things like World War I, and sociology having to reorient itself around this common history instead of progress being our object of inquiry. And she talks about all sorts of things about the rise of the university and and World War I and World War II. But one gaping thing that she doesn't discuss is the Cold War. And another thing that she doesn't discuss is, in particular, there's a wonderful book called Race Against Empire about this, is about the fact that a strong body of African-American sociologists and activists, Franklin Frazier was there, W.E.B. Du Bois was there, Cox and others, were actually linking US racism to imperialism and a strong critique of capitalism. They did this in their activist work, they were doing it in their academic work. And so part of canonization occurs in this context where the history of America is being taken out of the history of racism, that racism becoming psychologized about biases and attitudes, and a real psychological, that also in general, a deep suspicion to notions of political economy. And this is happening at the exact same time that canonization is happening, people like Parsons, etc. So actually, I link those two things, that the way in which even the past got remembered was a way that had to accommodate a vision of social progress and social change that evacuated a class narrative and evacuated a narrative about colonialism. So I'm like, okay, so these two things are happening at the same time, which also means that people like Fraser and Du Bois don't get to be part of the canonization process. Even though Fraser was president of the ASA in the 1940s, like he also knew Parsons. Um, you know what I mean? Like it's the same time that an American Dilemma. So there is a politics of race and the academy that is happening at the same time that the strategic decisions are being made about not only which theorists, but which problems. So part of, I think, of the decolonization is making that visible, like Victoria so ably said, making it visible, the politics of how a canon gets constructed. Why, in particular, you're sitting here having to do this when the economists don't, the anthropologists kind of, right? Like sociologists have a really particular relationship to having to put everyone through this socialization process of the classical and contemporary theory classes, but then having to pretend that the people are on the classical theory syllabus because of their just brilliance, that, you know, they naturally came together. So I like to show that process and then put that within America's political economy and talk about the fact Walter Rodney is right. So there's a whole other narrative about progress and the rise of industrial society, which is ostensibly what we're about, that becomes, that is actively being suppressed. And that has an impact on even how the people that get remembered and put in the canon, how they get put there, right? Like we don't get the Marx that's in conversation with Lincoln, who's talking about the Civil War. We don't get the Marx and Engels who are talking about America. We get the Marx who's only talking about Europe. We don't know that Weber came here in 1904. We don't get the Weber who was with Du Bois. We don't get the Du Bois who was in Germany. So the way that the past gets remembered and canonized, I think, is so critically connected to this particular moment in American the history of American social science in general and American sociology in particular.
Thank you.
Yeah. 100%. I don't know what more to add, if there's anything I can add. I guess I'll get to the second part of the question, which was implications. And right, so what are the implications of all this? And we can kind of think about and see, which is the continuation of the devaluation of certain types of knowledge, right? The continuation of racism in the academy that has kind of been the foundation of our profession, right? And when we're thinking about empire, when colonizers shape our narratives, right? I think, so Steinmetz has that, I'm looking around because maybe it's on my floor, sorry, that edited volume about sociology and empire. And we have to reckon with sociology as participating in empire, right? And the social sciences more generally, anthropology, right? That we are kind of complicit, and this is our history. And the response is not to shy away or ignore, to keep it in the dark, but to kind of interrogate and think about a future and what does that mean. So, you know, and as I mentioned, and as Connell mentions in her piece, right, that empire is actually foundational to our discipline as a subject of study, right? That's what people were talking about, and about kind of global societies, right? Not just those in the US, not just those in Western Europe, et cetera, but even the content of the writings of our discipline in the early days were about empire. And so it becomes this willful ignorance that gets passed on and almost rediscovered, right? And I'll talk about this later, but kind of where we keep the same points keep getting made. And so what does it mean, and how can we get it to stick? So we're not rediscovering, oh, the importance of empire in theory, or the importance of, you know, XYZ.
Thank you. So yeah, I think this sort of bleeds nicely into the next question, which is, how should we rethink the canon and sociological theory in general by incorporating traditionally marginalized voices? And whose work do you think is missing from the canon? I know you both sort of brought up these various thinkers at various points, and I'm wondering if you can expand on this. And maybe we can start with you, Victoria.
Yeah, sure. So with my paper, I really loved Reviewer 2. You know, Reviewer 2 can kind of get a bad rap, but I actually loved Reviewer 2 for my paper because they pushed me to think about, so what is the result? Should we expand the canon or should we shatter the canon? Do we need a canon? And it's one of those things that kind of struck me and I continue to kind of think about. And for that paper and kind of in small steps, it's about expanding it, right? So I teach Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, Ida B. Wells, Jane Addams, I teach Hobbes, I teach Rousseau, right? And I actually, thinking about social order, I think we need perspectives of and by people in the global South, right? So as I'm moving forward, thinking about Jose Rizal and I think in order to kind of expand or even shatter a canon, what we need to do is also rethink what constitutes writing about social theory, right? So decolonizing classical theory, I think, means rethinking about what types of writing constitute social theory. It's not journal articles, it's letters, it can be poems, it can be, so even Ida B. Wells was a journalist and thinking about knowledge production and different types of writing and what counts as theory. I think that in some spaces of sociology, we're such a big discipline, it's hard to say things about the discipline as a whole, but there are big pockets that are very gatekeeping to what constitutes sociology and what constitutes classical thinking. And I think if we really want to decolonize our discipline in theory in particular, we have to widen that. I think that we need to contextualize classical theory, as we mentioned, as not something grad students are exposed to once. And that's it. This is your classical theory class. And we need to talk about the politics of the syllabus, about who's included, who's not, to really kind of demystify these decisions and to know it is a decision, right? That these are decisions we should actively and intentionally make. We shouldn't just be teaching Marx, Weber, Durkheim, or whomever just because. And actually, what I'm going to do moving forward is list additional thinkers, right? We may not have time to cover. I'm on a quarter system, as I think most except two UC campuses are. That's 10 weeks. Plus you have a holiday, that's 9 weeks, right? There is only so much you can cover. And so thinking about additional thinkers in the list, what the syllabus is doing, what they're not doing, what's left out, and give students resources. And it's about setting up classes as the beginning of knowledge and as exposure rather than the end all be all. And finally, and this may be controversial, I don't know, I actually think we need to rethink and expand the time frame of what constitutes classical theory. We are now in 2021, right? Traditionally, I think classical theory kind of ends by the turn of the 20th century, by the 1920s. But why? Right? Why can't we include and expand to post-World War II, to 1945, and really think about these broad movements and writings about decolonization, right? Why can't we kind of inch closer to what is classical theory? Because again, if we think classical theory is something that is established, is useful, helps shape our thinking, then I think writers, Fanon, why is Fanon not considered a classical theorist, right? And so I think that may be the most controversial. I haven't really talked about that before, but I think that it's important. Time moves on, and so should our kind of frame of reference.
Hey, Zine.
Yeah, I mean, you really make a very good point about, how long does it stretch? Like, what time period are we including in classical theory, and then how expanding a time frame does allow us to bring in other theorists. And so, I mean, it's when you're actually having the practical business of trying to do something in 15 weeks, it's something I think about a lot, which is why I'm mildly obsessed with that that Cold War moment, because I also feel like it gives us a way of talking about why do we have the canon and politicizing that, and also showing like the politics of race that occurred around that moment of canonization. I think it also allows us to return to a part of sociology's history. Another thing that Victoria mentioned was that we were part of the project of doing empire. Like Connell talks a lot about like as a cultural response, but we actually were practical managers. And the only way to actually have that become visible is that we look at where sociology wasn't only oriented around the progress narrative, but particular on American soil, sociology for a long time was the discipline that took race relations, what we call race relations, as its object of inquiry. There's a wonderful book called by this guy, Stanford Lyman, and the first line is to trace the Black man in sociology is to trace the history of the discipline itself. And I would add, and its imperial and global formations, because it really starts as its area of inquiry is this slave question. The first book written is a defense of slavery, but it's not just a defense, it's an interrogation and a try to defense of slavery as a modern social system, and also an interrogation again of that question of, if a worker is not compelled by ownership, are they going to do any work? Which links me to the way that I seek to bring in other voices is, Connell makes this point that empire posed problems for liberalism. It's one of the pivots around which the article turns. And I've actually noticed that not just empire, but in particular, the ending of slavery posed problems for liberalism, because there was this question of, was it going to be ended under the principles of free markets and free labor? Like, was the notion of liberal and the invisible hand? Or there were others that said you were going to need some other system of not only allocating labor, but they pointed out, as many, they're like, but slavery is the best system of socialism. It's a cradle to grave protection of the worker. So now to us, it's a horrifying concept, but they're actually speaking of what happens when the market mechanism allocates what happens to you, right? Like and that's all part of this question, because feudalism and slavery are organized around obedience and dependence. What happens when it is this other system? So to bring it all the way around, something that became important for those liberals, particularly those that were interested in sociology, is all these experiments that are happening on the African continent to so-called replace the slave trade with the legitimate trade. And that's why we even have the country of Liberia, founded by the American Colonization Society, which is, again, stuff that Du Bois is aware of. It's part of his fight with Booker T. Washington. The colony of Sierra Leone is also a liberal experiment that is about, how do we still get the crops grown? What do we do with the free people the people don't want them in their countries anymore, right? Like, did they go to Nova Scotia, go to Sierra Leone? So there's all of these free labor experiments on the African continent. South Africa comes into view. Like, this is the original thing that many of the missionaries are doing. So I haven't actually decided who these different people are that I'm going to have speaking to this issue, because there are so many, and you recognize that the people we call the classics, also we're aware, like it comes in sentences into the people that really stretch it out, develop it, are people like Du Bois, are people like Anna Juliet Cooper. That's why she wrote her dissertation about the Haitian Revolution. So to me, it's like you have this way of using the evacuation of race and colonialism in the 40s to also say, there's a set of theorists, I'm thinking of Walter Rodney in particular, C.L.R. James, who allow us to look back at that history of the making of industrial society with a better set of lenses. Because when we are saying sociology is the science of the new industrial society, there's a narrative about the development of Europe that's there, that kind of thinks about, it imagines that Europe became Europe by its own endogenous processes. That's kind of fundamental. Like, there's a hidden historical narrative about the rise of the West embedded not only in the classical curriculum as it's taught right now, but also in the imagining of, this thing that you're explaining. But there's a whole other tradition of people who queried that from long ago. So I even find that it's nice to have a companion, like Eric Williams becomes your companion to revisit what Comte was writing about when he's trying to explain, or C.L.R. James becomes your companion to talk about French society as you're also looking at how Comte did it. So again, it's something that I'm still working out in the writing of the book and the teaching of the course, but I also find it as a way to bring another set of analytical voices in there and their theories, but it is also on the level of a meta interrogation of the canonization process itself.
Thank you so much. And now I want to circle back to something that Victoria brought up earlier, which is the question of how can we place the canon in conversation with contemporary scholarship? And Victoria, do you want to get started with this?
Sure, although I think I started last time.
Okay,
So,
either way is fine.
yeah, okay, I'm fine. So I think part of what we've been talking about shows its relevance for how we teach about it, right? So I think that our conversation so far, and the way we're talking about theory, to me, the conversation it's having with contemporary scholarship, that what people are writing about now in sociology is completely relevant. The ties are clear. What the problem is when classical theory is taught as this stable set of readings that you need to memorize and learn as just a barrier you have to get through in graduate school, right? But instead, right, if we think about the canon in the ways in which we're talking about right now, if we teach it in the ways in which we're talking about right now, I think that the conversation it has with contemporary scholarship is very obvious. I also think we need to recognize the ways in which some people are already, right, engaged in these conversations, right? I think one of the things I get so frustrated about, and part of this I think is also the politics of this publish or perish. You have to say something new and try to publish in particular journals, and so you say something new when in fact people have long been talking about things, right? So to me, this kind of question is very parallel to, you know, the movement for hashtags like cite Black women, right? In this piece I'm writing about kind of the global South, and thinking about how the cyclical nature of sociology and trying to reinvent the wheel and say we're saying something new, that in fact recognizing who is already writing about this, right? Recognizing their expertise, looking to them on how we can think about how they inform our contemporary scholarship. So I think that's the number one thing, right? Is that sociology is so rich outside the mainstream ASR, AJS, et cetera, and that really what we need to do is expand our reading. But in order to do that, we also have to expand the systems that put kind of this pressure on AJS, ASR in place, right? That we need to value writing that occurs in other journals and different types of journals. So that's one, and you know, and I think, yeah, so I'll go there. I know Zane wants to chime in.
Yeah, and another really nice and fruitful thing is looking at there's an interesting thing that American sociology has been so hegemonic that it has touched sociologies around the world. Even like the connection I know best is the connection of the histories of the South African sociology and American sociology. And, you know, long story short, you know, the discipline, you know, one of its iconic departments at the University of Stellenbosch was established by Americans. It was established as a result of this Carnegie Commission to look into white poverty. And like there's these such strong connections with the history of sociology in the US and the history of sociology in South Africa. And I'm seeing in other places because in particular, the role that sociologists played in all of these educational commissions, which were again part of the colonial project that was really sociology's purview, that they went and did all of these studies about like native education. But in doing so, even reading those reports, they're talking to a lot of people and they're dealing with a lot of activist people at the time, because they're like, some of these people are terrible threats. And we would like to, like in the words of Robert Park, you know, create an native intelligentsia that is reasonable, that is rational, and that is comfortable with slow advance on Western terms. So again, this notion of the creation of an indigenous elite, there are strong connections between sociology in the United States and at least some of the areas that I know best in Southern Africa and some places in West Africa. And a lot of, and again, especially in Africa, like Jomo Kenyatta was a sociologist. Like there's a lot of interesting connections whereby sociology has this idea attached to it of that like progressive change in a certain kind of way. And also this notion of like connected to what we might broadly call indirect rule, that there's this notion of like shaping educational institutions and the trafficking back and forth between a class of intellectuals. And, so that's why, again, in my teaching, Booker T. Washington and its project in the South, we often think about it as being so local, as being like, stay on the farm, stay in the South. And we hardly know that Booker T. Washington was also pretty global. Like, he wanted to take the Tuskegee model and globalize it. And in fact, many colonial leaders looked to the United States as having successfully managed its race problem in ways that should be copied. And because sociology was so central to that settling, it becomes this discipline that is all over the world. And again, this is something that's just a bit at the beginning, but it has been very fruitful that people find the history of sociology so much more interesting than the truncated history that typically comes along with the narrative about, the science of the new industrial society. And you know what I mean? Like, our history is way more interesting. Even the times where we were on the side of the bad guys is a lot more interesting. And when we get beyond good guys and bad guys, gives you an incredible resource for thinking about, how did we get to have the world that we have today, in ways that are much more useful than the kind of static ways that, Victoria, you've been critiquing so well, that frozen in amber kind of thing that goes on so often.
Thank you. So my last question is, in terms of our own scholarship, how can classical theory inform current sociological research and approaches? And I'll let whoever wants can sort of jump into this one first.
Okay. I think, again, that notion about what decolonizing classical theory to me has done is that it allows an entirely new set of problems to become relevant as sociological problems, not just alienation or the usual, what you like, the core units or core ideas. It actually suggests that many of the things that students are and professors are quite interested in now, issues of inequality, processes of racialization, colonialism, even intersectionality, a lot of these things, given a different angle on our own history, these become things that were core issues to sociology from the beginning. Like, Gurminder Brahambra has this great critique where she talks about the notion of the system and the social. And there's certain ideas and practices and processes that are considered the system. And the other things, racism, sexism, gender, they're kind of the social. And she's like, that analytical bifurcation is not about actually a good reflection about how the world came to be. It actually reflects these processes, the way that the canon worked, that it imposes this weird artificial dichotomy. So some things become adjunct to general sociological concern, such that, like, even the division is in me, in my person, in my teaching, in my department. I teach both the contemporary theory course, which is possibly about things that are universal and general, and I teach the contemporary race course, racial theories. One course everyone is required to take who's a PhD student or master's student, the contemporary theory course. The contemporary race theory course is also graduate level, but it's optional. So in the own division of our department and the division of my own academic labor in that department rehearses this system social and things that are universal and abstract in general as theory, and then things that are adjunct, race. And so, you got to teach the way they tell you to. But in both of the classes, I problematize it and say, how did it come to be? Why is contemporary race theory not just what you might learn? Like, why is race a topic? And other things are universal problems. Like, why is race a topic or a problem that happens to some people, rather than a generalized feature of a system, that it belongs right there with all of our core ideas? And so this new orientation that I think Victoria and I are both working towards is a troubling of those sort of divisions, such that these topics just become central, not just to our students, but to the discipline in general. Journal of Race and Ethnicity, lots of articles about race. American Sociological Review, 1 or 2. So it also keeps rehearsing this idea. Some things are abstract and universal in general. Other things are particularistic. They're topics. They're adjunct to the broader universal things that sociology is supposed to be examining.
Thank you, Victoria.
Yeah. I mean, I agree 100%. And I'll just add that I think when we demystify and almost excite classical theory, right? This is what happens is it's exciting to talk about this long lineage of thought. What it does, I mean, for my own research and for others is really to think about who are we in conversation with, right? To think about and situate ourselves in a longer scholarly conversation that continues to be relevant today. Again, I think for me, part of this question also builds on what we've been talking about throughout the past hour or whatnot. Is that classical theory and the things that we're talking about, empire, race, are so central to what's happening today, right? Exactly what Sine is talking about. And so classical theory and studying it as these sets of relations, as who's in conversation with one another, thinking about their global reach and interrogating these as products of scholarship that are also contested and how they become canonized, lets us think about how we are today. I think that sometimes people see history as the past, as stable, as this is what happened and let me go from there. But instead, what it allows us to do is think about dynamics and think about and problematize the conversations we're currently having are the same. It sees this continue the continuities and the discontinuities of the production of knowledge, right? And how we continue to be active in these things today, right? So I don't know how many sociologists, but if we think about sociology's role in empire, the CIA has a human terrain, office that hires anthropologists, right? And thinking about that, how we talk about and how we use our scholarship is also not neutral. I think this is a big conversation that continues, right? This is what I try to emphasize in my classes when I speak to students that I work with, is it's a continuation of long conversations, right? That we're having about objectivity, subjectivity, how do we present our research, how are we teaching how to write, who are we kind of thinking about, who are we referencing? I think these are all questions that as we think about classical theory, that is certainly relevant today, right? And how we can kind of approach the social moment that in which we are in, right? I think that that's what we need to recognize. That's our duty as teachers, is to also just think about theory as something that people can do, right? Even undergrads in my classical theory class, undergrads, it's knowledge production. Theory is not something that is up in the air and is untouchable, but in fact, you, as someone who is taking my undergraduate class, can critique it, can tell me, I learned from my students how they're seeing the parallels between Hobbes and now social order. That's how I structure the class, is to get them to think about it. So I think that yeah, it's so important. And that's why I don't see this distinction between research and teaching. I think that they should inform one another. How we approach our research is how we approach our teaching, and they build on one another. And my scholarship in and of itself, I write about, I don't have these bifurcated categories that for research I do one thing, for teaching I do another thing. And I think thinking about classical theory in this way can kind of just help sharpen our thinking about our research in general.
Great. Thank you so much. This has been an extremely insightful discussion. And I want to just, since I want to have some time for other people to ask questions, I want to move to the Q&A now. And to make this a more interactive experience, maybe we can use the hand raising function, and then you can unmute yourself to ask the question. If you have trouble doing this, you can use the chat instead. But I'll hand it over, and I see Jean has her hand up.
Oh, great. I didn't think I would be the first one. Yeah, so thanks to you both but I'm happy to be, to lower the bar for subsequent questions. No, so thank you so much to you both for being here, for these really provocative, insightful remarks. I just want to ask a quick question that I think was sort of latent in what you said, but I think maybe might be worth spelling out a bit. which is sort of like what a theory course in general, the work that a theory course in general does in an undergraduate curriculum versus a graduate curriculum. And you both sort of talked about teaching different kinds of courses, but it strikes me that, of course, for the undergraduate major, we have an intro course that does a lot of work around not just theory, but just sort of like what is social construction, yada yada yada. But we don't have a related kind of intro to class in grad school, right? And so I think that there's a way, I mean, I'm sort of thinking about this when you guys were talking, like, there's a way that like a classical theory class in a graduate curriculum is supposed to do that work and supposed to sort of say like, this is like sociologists think about Marx this way and Weber that way. So I just wondered if you could maybe speak a little bit about sort of like how you see those things contrasting in terms of what a theory class does on the undergraduate and graduate level. And then I just had a quick comment sort of related to kind of my question, which was that 100 years ago, when I was an undergraduate at Northwestern, I took a theory class with Wendy Espin. And one of the things that was so interesting in that class that really got me really excited about being a sociology major was how she often paired, classical theoretical works with more contemporary scholarship. So, for example, we read Zimmel, but then we read Elijah Anderson's, I think it was A Place on the Corner, right? And thinking about like how he uses sociability. So that was just sort of a more suggestion in thinking about undergraduate pedagogy. It's something that really worked for me, but I would love to hear your thoughts about that distinction. Thanks.
You can go first. Okay. If you like.
I mean, well, you bring up that really important point of like the performative work that this classical theory thing does. That it's like this ritual that everybody has to go through, and another thing that also it comes along with that is that a lot of the times people were teaching it like that's not their thing. Like they literally are just like, you got to do this. And so it's an interesting moment of people's broad introduction to the discipline, but few people go to graduate school wanting to think specifically about the canon. Except for like, a slightly nutty person right here. But for the most part, it's just not. So, the work that I often like, the courses that the undergraduates like the best are done exactly like what you described. Like I haven't actually taught our undergrad theory since I was at the University of Illinois. I've never taught it at Boston College. I've only ever taught the graduate one. But how it needs to come to alive for undergrads is I think exactly that pairing. Because at the graduate level, there's that idea that you're learning theory with a capital T, and also that's the stuff that gets into the high impact journals. So there's like, there is the encouragement of abstraction with a capital T in the class, and that these were the first guys to do it really great. So, I'm not sure how I would do it if I was doing it for undergrads, because I just haven't done it for them for so long. But I do find again that the way in which people are primed, what they're primed to expect in their classical theory course, and the dread in some ways, like the intimidation factor that they feel, because it's supposed to be theory with a capital T that's so abstracted, that I have found that people respond incredibly well, not only to the historicization of how did we end up with it, and also, sociologists in empire has actually given people an entryway in that allows them to work to capital T theory, and also recognize that like there isn't really capital T theory at the end of the day. I don't know how well that answers it, but that's kind of been my experience.
And I have the opposite, right? Is I teach undergrad and I haven't taught grad, theory. And so I'm not sure how I would teach grad theory, but I would have to cover less probably because I go for breadth over depth. But I still have undergrads read original writings, but I deconstruct it. And what I do is I have them, I do a lot of kind of these, even kind of during virtual, is this application, right? So when I have taught, right, mechanical and organic solidarity and restitutive and repressive law, right, which I'm probably not going to again, I ask, so do you think this is applicable today? What do you think about the murders of unarmed Black men that are happening? And I get them thinking about, so that there is okay, so this is what Durkheim is saying. Do you think it's applicable? If you do, what strands are applicable and what's not? And so then it becomes a conversation where they see theory in their current lives, right? So when I teach, I also teach some urban, and it's actually really surprising because, you know, a lot of the critiques of, for example, the Chicago school come from like LA and it doesn't fit. But in fact, students talk about how it does fit, the concentric circles, which is very odd. But I think that how I teach it is about applicability, and to say that it's okay, right? I asked them, so compare, Marx and Weber and the sources of social stratification and inequality, and which one do you agree with more and why? So it becomes knowledge production. You have to explain to me. And so I think that that's important, because the role, but I also know that's not how it's taught with other instructors, even in my department, or in other places. But I think that that's key, is this application and demystifying, that it's about relevance, and that it's okay and it's good to critique classical theory, and it's this engagement. So that's how I teach undergrad. I imagine I teach graduate theory the same, but I'm not sure. But I agree that there is this, and I get these comments that, I dreaded this class. We're just going to learn about dead old white men. And I put that in my syllabus. I'm right. You tend to think, what do you think of? I do this kind of even in-person class, this word cloud. What do you think of when you think of theory? And it's like dead old white men, right? Like that's what comes up in these things. And so I think it's just, again, this pushing towards knowledge production, and undergraduates can be so incredibly in tune with how it relates. Like we have such incredibly smart and engaged students. And I think it's about giving them those tools and having them see themselves as participants in knowledge production. And sorry, I can go on a tangent, but.
Yeah, thank you. Kum.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thank you, both of you, for a very stimulating set of thoughts. In listening to you, I started to wonder why we would ever call a course classical and theory. Theory is nothing without, if you like, method. Theory comes out from people's lives, emerges from people's lives, et cetera, And I'm someone who thinks it's very important to teach Durkheim and Weber and all the stuff I don't like as well, so that people can critique, people can bring forward their critiques of that work, and yet know what they say. So I'm a big fan of teaching everything, but I wonder about calling it classical and theory. I mean, when you think about Barbara Christian or Lourdes Benaria or Angela Davis, Ellen Meiskens Wood, for example, Uma Narayan, Paula Giddings, we can just go on and on and on. And they all do theory, they all write theory, but it's in a different way. So I just wondered what you thought. I mean, it's probably the worst thing to say, but can we remove classical and theory from the title of our classes and yet teach all the stuff? I'm not suggesting we don't teach it.
Yeah, I actually, that orientation that you point out is exactly, because I also teach the contemporary theory course. And so another question I ask the students is like, okay, last semester I dragged you through classical, now we're in contemporary. But from whence does this division divide to come from? Mm-hmm. And it actually hinges on the idea that the contemporary theorists are some sort of elaboration on the big ideas that were first developed by the brilliant people during the classical time, who again, it authorizes this idea that they're on there because of just it really naturalizes it, that it was just these brilliant ideas that were the core ideas, and that's why they're there. I don't know if I'm putting it well, but the classical contemporary architecture that grounds many departments, the one that I teach in, the contemporary theory, because I always ask the students, well, when did contemporary start? And it's some students are like, I don't know, 1980, like they generally pick the year before. So it's interesting because what it actually is gesturing towards is it's still oriented around that idea of the classics that Connell takes down so well in that article. Because the contemporary imagines that it's paired with classical. And then it has a narrative of why the classical canon is what it is and what came to be on there. So I actually think that troubling that's precisely how I start both of the courses. And then, it's 15 weeks, you have what is, but there's no real reason why all the people that you mentioned couldn't all be there, right? And again, yeah, the classical contemporary, it's a rather artificial binary that grows out of that history.
But I think the question could maybe be extended to then why have a class called contemporary in theory, right? And so, to me, this question gets at the politics of academia in our profession, right? And it gets to questions of academic freedom and people who want to teach certain things and don't teach other things. And so what Zine says is the architecture of like departments is to somehow ensure that at least a few of these people will be taught. I mean, in the catalog, I'm supposed to go over Compt, I'm supposed to go over Spencer, I'm supposed to go over all these people. And I did for my first time because I felt, compelled to. And then now I don't feel compelled to, right? So I choose, and I wouldn't want academic freedom taken away from me because I like the way I teach theory, right? And so I think it gets at this inherent tension in the discipline for, while we are committed to thinking about these thinkers and this contemporary, not everyone is, right? And so I don't know how to answer that question because I think that the politics of classes, of the architecture of our discipline, of the architecture of departments, that to do away with a classical theory class or like rename it something, you have to have buy-in, right? You have to have people who are similarly committed to this, because I think that there gets, at least in my experience, maybe my experience is not the norm, but I could tell you that the longest conversations we have in faculty meetings are about minutia and titles and how do you word things. And so I can just even imagine the renaming of classical theory. It's not even named classical theory in my department. It's the development of sociological thought or something like that. But I think your question reminds me, it's the politics. It's the politics of academia and how we teach and how things are structured.
Perhaps that's the first way. I'll stop after this, Hannah, I promise. Thank you. It's the first way to actually decolonize sociological theory is to not call it classical or theory. But anyway, I'll stop now.
Thank you. Tristan.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here. This was really informative and it was great to hear from both of you. I just wanted to know one thing that didn't come up that I just would love to hear you both reflect on is whether or not, and this might be like a graduate undergraduate distinction with theory, but whether or not you talk at all about research method and like some of the theorists that I think Zine is speaking of when talking about capital T theory, some of the research methods that are actually deployed in some of those projects that we think of as so canonical, when we look into them, they're pretty thin. And I just wonder if you talk about that at the undergraduate and graduate level and sort of how you.
Yeah, I'll start. I do, right? So Verstehen, when I teach Weber, I teach Verstehen. When I taught Compt and Spencer that one time, right? I talk about positivism and the rise of positivism. Thinking about Durkheim and social facts and thinking about kind of method. How I see method and data is simply data is where we get our information from, and method is how we choose that information, right? And so, I teach the method and how they get about that, whether it's, Sine talked about people always teach double consciousness, right? And thinking about the importance of, standpoint theory. That's why I teach Anna Julia Cooper, right? And thinking about Black feminist thought and thinking about intersectionality, and it's important to think about, but I don't, so I teach method, and I teach how they get the information they do, but it's not value laden, in terms of I really try to get them in a similar way. I, sometimes I think my TAs don't like it, but I have essay exams, right? I give them rubrics, I try to like help out, but I think it's really important to write. And I think it's really important to think about what claims you're making and do your data metric claims. And while that seems very positivistic, all I'm talking about is what information, what are you arguing, and where are you getting your information from? Be that personal experience, newspapers, from the text itself. And so that's how I incorporate theory, because I agree with who has also mentioned that this theory and method can't easily be disentangled from one another.
And I've also found, this is one of those things where you learn so much when you have to teach something to someone, that the methods that they use are a great site of the actual doing of decolonizing the discipline, because so often they used history. Comte always said, even though he's the big positivist guy, sociology is based on history. And he narrates a lot of historical events that are also the focus of Marx's work, somewhat the focus of Durkheim, the focus of Du Bois. So, I mean, one of my favorites is like, Comte actually was obsessed with the French Revolution and the English Revolution. He's like totally obsessed with King Charles getting said, the Glorious Revolution, the whole thing. So he has this weird thing. He has this little line that he says about, the navigation acts, and now like they're the worst thing ever. And he talks about it relating to the English Revolution. Well, if you pivot and you actually bring in what Marx noticed, and also what Du Bois noticed, is they're like, oh yeah, Oliver Cromwell, yeah, he chopped off the king and hated the monarchy, but also he was the guy with the Western design that conquered Jamaica. So it's interesting. I have found that like the history that they narrate, sometimes they both mention an event, but there's another scholar who can further decolonize the same event that they find pivotal. And for me, this whole process has involved learning so much European history that actually, though, like I couldn't have cared less about the English Revolution until I connected it with Cromwell, the founding of Jamaica. And then all of a sudden, again, it allows a way of tying together, like, why are you reading this stupid essay by Comte? But then, my goodness, there's a natural point of connection and his very method is historical. Another method that they used was, often they said that the science part came out of the comparative. So they actually were really interested in societies all over. I mean, Durkheim's probably the paradigmatic example of this. But again, when they reach around the world to try to say like, oh, this process happened everywhere, they will mention events and persons that again can be brought more into view, right? Like, and again, other writings of the same person, like Marx wrote a great deal about Algeria. Comte also was interested in Algeria, like it was during his lifetime in 1830. So I'm also, and again, I'm still at the formative stages of this, but there are other places that they wrote about that can also be sites of productive, like, still playing around with, well, Comte writes about Algeria, Marx wrote about Algeria, even Durkheim has, he was French, he was aware of it. Is Algeria a point of, an anchor for discussion, for bringing these theorists in with Algeria as a pivot? I'm still working my way through it, but it does connect with the method question, because so much of their method involved either looking at the immediate past or looking all around the world for comparative examples.
And can I just, I know, Zakia, you have a question, your hand raised. I just want to jump in that I think that this question is so important because the methods we use, and again, this gets back to our contemporary society, our contemporary scholarship shapes what we see, right? And so to lay bare that, I mean, I have this methods paper under review, I workshop it, and people want to push, well, are certain things only studied in certain ways, right? Can you only study it in certain ways? And I think no, that in fact, using different methods to study the same things reveals different aspects that are important for social life, right? That you can study, that it's important to think about how methods really shape how we see and understand certain things, the methods that we use. So anyway, sorry.
Great, thank you, Zakia.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you both for joining us for a great conversation, and it's really making me think back to my theory classes in grad school, and when like students of color got together and were like, hey, like we need more on our syllabus, and also like that there was no discussion of gender, right? Like just all swaths of folks, like just not acknowledged. And we're still having the conversation 15 years later. So I wanted to pull out something, regarding teaching. You mentioned earlier, right? Teaching doesn't get really the attention it deserves in many ways, particularly at research institutions. And you've both talked about different ways in both undergrad and in one case, grad courses. You've done this work. Are there other ways? I think that for many people, the thing becomes like, well, how do you practically do this, right? And for those of us who have training around some of this, like it's second nature, but for others, right, and really thinking about how do you also bring in sort of decolonizing practices into the classroom, right? What does that look like as well, sort of when you're doing this work? So if you wanted to share anything. Yeah.
I mean, I have been fortunate to have been in a department where this kind of like shaking of foundations has not been, everybody's like, oh, that's cool, that's fun. But I have given so many talks at places where this is a big deal. Like people do not like their canon messed around with. Like I gave a talk at Harvard, it had become a massive issue. And so in many PhD programs, that classical theory classroom is like an intense site of struggle and an intense site of silencing, which again, I have been a bit fortunate in being in a department where it was not such a big deal. So, but I do think like, it has become such a contentious issue that, I mean, in some departments, it's the mere introduction of these notions, and some people view as horrid politicizing, but it's also like an act of like decolonizing apparently the intellectual space. Like, I mean, literally, I had not thought I was doing anything other than, oh, wouldn't it be interesting to explore this? And then going to talk after talk after talk, where graduate students are like, this split our classical theory class right down the middle. Like half the time it was why I got invited, because there had been such a big fight. Like, there's this woman over there that writes about this. And I mean, I guess that's just my all that I would have to say on the topic, because again, I've not been in a department where it has caused people to fight badly, but I am quite aware that there are many departments where it has been a real flashpoint.
Yeah, so this is great. I'll take the other side of the question. So Zane talks about like even the approach we've been talking about to what we present. And I think the other side of decolonizing the classroom is our orientation to students. Yeah. Who are the students, right? And this includes graduate and undergraduate, right? And part of this is I taught our teaching sociology class for graduate students, and I think that decolonizing the classroom means a fundamental revisioning of what the classroom is, what the purpose is, and who learners are and who can contribute. So for my classes, one of the things I do is I see students as future colleagues who have things to contribute, who I want them to engage in I see them as active learners. And even just, I was on Facebook and someone posted something and I said something and there's such this pushback where classrooms are seen as students as empty vessels in which we pour knowledge. And that is not how life works, right? That's not how I see kind of learning. People come with embodied knowledge, with knowledge from other classes. And so to create a space of learning and engagement, I think is so important to the foundation of decolonizing the class, because you can't even begin if you see kind of students as you're the expert, they're the learner, they aren't contributors in kind of this process of learning, right? Like I try to, even when I have TAs, right, or in for graduate students, that all of us are learners. Doesn't mean that I'm not I have a PhD, this is what I get pushback on. Well, you have the PhD and are you saying you don't have more knowledge? I'm like, that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying let's create a space of learning and contribution and to respect one another's insight. And so I think this orientation towards what the classroom is supposed to be and our orientation to students is so central to decolonizing the classroom.
Great, thank you. I know I'm running a bit over time and we could be here all day, so we'll make this the last question.
Sorry, my son.
Kevin.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, this is something that people have been wrestling with in so many different ways. I want to invite everyone to join the History of Sociology section, which I'm chair of, which is about to become the History of Sociology and Social Thought. And thought, of course, includes those who aren't yet even included in not just the canon, but the discipline. What would, if you roll it back, I mean, I was really appreciative as Zeno talked about the Cold War and about the canonization versus the canon, because Weber was kind of canonized as the anti-Marx, and Marx, of course, is the great absence. If you look at Parsons' Structure of Social Action, we're supposed to do Weber and Durkheim, and they're really pretty similar after all, which is a bizarre notion. And Marx is not there. And when I started at Northern Illinois University as late as the 90s, there were 2 required theory courses for undergrads, which was quite a commitment to theory, pretty unusual. And one was called History of Social Thought, which went from Aristotle to Marx. And then sociology theory started with Comte, Durkheim, and Weber. So that's the way that was done. So the Marx, Weber, Durkheim, wasn't it partly getting Marx in there? That's how I remember it in the 70s and 80s in grad school. And then race and colonialism were just so there. And I don't know how they disappeared. I mean, one of the people I always teach is Frantz Fanon, who's not on any, I don't see him very often on any sociological canon, but to me, he's one of the 4 or 5 greatest thinkers of the 20th century. Maybe if we weren't chronological, as I think Victoria was suggesting, it might be a way to have more of these kinds of dialogues within our courses. Anyway, just I don't have a real. Just anyone who wants to react to any of that, I'd be interested.
Well, I'm in the section and would also like to make a plug for it. It's a great section. And when are we going to have that? Aren't we supposed to have something about the 1930s? Because, like, again, you learn so much just as you're writing and teaching. I mean, Victoria, I think you talked about like, oh, that whole teaching is over there and writing is over there. Like for me, like the process of teaching has been one of the best things that's happened to this book. And this realization of this incredible moment of the 1930s, both for the discipline, for American social life, but also when, this moment of, it was one of the strongest moments in the 30s and into the 40s of anti-colonial activism amongst African-American intellectuals. And so I'm like, all of this stuff has got to go together. I'm just trying to figure out how it all went together. So in some ways, periodization is important, I think, for understanding, because each one is sort of added in at different times along the process. But also that what is also coming into view for me is that like people like Parsons also were writing about American race relations and had a way of bifurcating what they were doing over there, talking about the Negro problem, and then over here involved in this project of like canonization and remembering Weber. And I'm like, there's got to be some sort of connection between the way in which Parsons had, okay, we have to understand the Negro problem in this way. It has nothing to do with class struggle. It's all about like, he's all into Myrtle and the American creed, like this very idealist way. He even, I think, wrote like one of the sections of Myrtle's book. And the guy who's remembering Weber in this particular way, and who's forgetting that Weber talked to Marx. He's forgetting that Weber wrote about Polish migrant labor. You know, he's like totally evacuating certain parts of Weber's history as he's orienting. So I don't have a good answer for you other than, yes, everybody should join that history of sociology section. Please, let's do something more in the 1930s as well. And I also agree about the topically and thematically, like you need a chronology in some ways to understand the history of our discipline, where canonization came in and how it shaped how the canon got made, how the past got remembered. But in order to also accommodate, you know, Fanon also really belongs and many others, how do you put it in? It is much more thematically. And again, it's something that I'm actually still working out. Even organizing a book like this is very difficult, trying to figure out how not just to tell a story of, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, because that's not really the meat of what you're getting at.
Yeah, I know we're short on time, and you know my kids are home. Hopefully, my 6-year-old doesn't come up either. And so I'll just quickly say, you know, I think your question is exactly right. It's getting at this gatekeeping, and who is sociological and who is not, which is so funny because even some of our founders are not trained as sociologists, right? And so I think that, and there are a few ways in which to think about this, and I'm eager to hear when Zena, you come to your conclusion, right? Because on one hand, this methods piece I have is exactly this, that people don't experience time linearly also, and so we need to write about time not linearly. You know, and a lot of people have, particularly Black feminist sociologists have written that way. But on the other hand, what is it that makes it classical? And to me, it gets back again to this usefulness and this establishment of thinking, right? And its usefulness. So one kind of more immediate response would be, as I mentioned before, is expanding what we consider classical to include post 1945, post World War II, right? And to the 60s, and Fanon would be included with that. And with so many thinkers, part of that is thinking about who are we not including, who are we including, and revealing those processes and providing lists, right? Because lists of other thinkers, because who we include and who we don't include, if we talk about all of these other thinkers that aren't on our list and explain the reasoning why, gets at exactly this, that it's not these figures in particular who only have these important thoughts, but it's a political process. That knowledge production is a political process. And so I think that's why it's central to even start off and acknowledge, sorry, whenever my kids are here, my thinking kind of goes away.
That's why I had to run to the office, but I'll also have to run back to pick somebody up. So
Thank you.
It never takes place in the classroom.
Thank you both so much. And I appreciate you both, especially taking time during the craziness of the pandemic. And this was an extremely, extremely enriching discussion. So I really appreciate it. And thank you also for everyone who attended this event for helping us kick off our Brown Bag series for racial justice. And please stay tuned for our next Brown Bag, which we will be announcing later in the quarter. So thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Thanks so much for inviting. And
yes, I agree.
Thanks so much. That was great. Thank you.
Bye.